We got people online, about people in the house.
Go on this side, actually.
All right.
All right.
These guys came down especially for us to present this. One from Boston, one from Vancouver. It's Acquia and many sites in a platform, which is something that Chapter 3 deals with all the time, as you guys know. So this should be a super interesting conversation on how they deal with multiple sites on their platform. So thank you, Acquia, for coming.
Thanks. We'll start with some quick introductions and see if I can get this.
Oh,
There we go. So I'm Pete. Don't mind the picture. I used to work for a company that did a lot of finance stuff, so. But I'm product marketing for our cloud products, and my role in the company, I've been there since November of last year, is really to look at what you all need in the platform to get your jobs done, and help our product managers prioritize how our platform advances. And some of the stuff that we'll get into tonight are things that we're building in to make governing and managing massive amounts of sites make sense.
All right, so I'm Rick. That picture's in my garden, a little bit less formal. Coming up from Vancouver, but I've been with Acquia for about 5 years. Managed the solutions architecture team for the West. So I've got a pre-sales engineering team, a team Drupalist. Been involved in Drupal one way or another for about 10 years now.
Yeah, so if you can't tell, Rick is from Vancouver and I'm the one stuck in Boston. So. All right, so what we're going to cover tonight, we're going to go through a lot of things, and you'd be lucky you'll be spared from me, and Rick is going to get into the really cool stuff. But we're going to talk about distribution development, loose versus rigid governance on your data, on your sites, how it relates to compliance if you're in a regulated industry. So all these kinds of different questions you need to figure out with an organization when you're setting up a multi-site type of thing. The never-ending battle with multi-site between discrete code bases, and how content reuse and syndication fits into this large framework when you've got tons of sites out there and you're looking for consistency and making sure everything is updated the right way, and then build management tools and dependency management using Composer. So
just one thing before we move on. In the audience here, is anyone managing many sites within the organization? Is there a role? How many sites roughly, say?
Like 10 or 20.
10 or 20?
Like 40.
40?
Over 200?
Over 200, all right.
Yeah, anybody else?
About a dozen?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So I think we're talking to the right crowd.
Yeah, and Sherry says hop. All right. So what is the average? So first of all, who cares? You know, why are we even talking about this? On average, there are 268 digital properties working in any organization out there. This is research from Forrester. Now, digital properties is a pretty broad term. So it could be internets, all the different types of nets you might want to come up with, different types of applications, Android, iOS. So they have a methodology where they counted them up and took an average, and they probably counted each technology discretely. But any way you look at it, that's a lot of properties to keep track of. So it's something that is only going to get worse, because if you look at what the average marketer, a guy like me, is doing, you've got your brand.com and your Facebook and your social media and your commerce site and your individual accounts attached to a person, and you're using data from those to connect into the systems at the bottom here. And you want to talk to people through all kinds of different channels. There's more coming all the time. Web, mobile, those are kind of your table stakes now. If you don't support all those, you're doing it wrong. But you're tying into campaigns and making it more of a journey, so that conversation you're having with somebody digitally is going across your phone to your email and then back to the web again. And when we know who you are and you've raised your hand, that experience is really built to go around those circles. So this is really what drives multi-site, is that you're having different experiences at different places at different times. And on different devices. So this is just some quick pictures. You've got your traditional, your laptop, your tablet, and your mobile. We are all familiar with those, but now you've got connected devices like chatbots with the Echo Dots really taking off. OpenText, I just noticed today, has announced an AI as well. So there's more and more AI and chatbot type things coming out there. You've got smart doorbells from Ring, Apple Watches, et cetera. So more and more of our things are connected to the net, and it gives us more and more opportunity to engage customers. So with all this content going so many different places and different ways to develop it and get it out there, how are you going to maintain some sort of strategy around how this content is used out in the world? So there's a number of different strategies, and we can probably play off each other a little bit on this, but loose versus centralized. What does that mean? So loose, each brand, each department may be making their own decisions on technology. They're making their decisions on how the technology is managed, what modules they might be running, what front end they might be using, are they going to decoupled or not? Or centralized, there's a central IT group that says these are the things you'll use. And there's also all the flavors in between. A lot of times that flavors in between is you provide a starting point. That's where distributions come in. And then finally, you always need to ask the question. Am I in a regulated environment? Do I need to be concerned with the types of data that are coming in over my sites? Is it PCI compliant, doing commerce sites? So do you need to control that payment information where it goes? Am I working with healthcare? Is this protected health information that applies to HIPAA? Am I in financial services? Is there information about investments going across, and how are we protecting that both in transit and at rest, and where does it go? So all these questions are groups coming together and figuring out how are we going to maintain all these rules. So with that, the keys really around organization.
Yeah, so I think a lot of governance comes down to there's many ways to go and skin the cat, and what works at one organization or one type of organization doesn't necessarily work in another. So a lot of it comes down to the first understanding the organization itself. How are they organized? What battles might you have to fight to change things within that organization to be more efficient? I think one of the examples I usually like to go and talk about is EDU. So, within education, the way that universities are structured can vary greatly from, one university to the next. In some cases, there's a lot more rigid central IT organization, and that all of the faculties or different groups go to central IT when they need to go and spin up a new website for their sociology department, history department, whatever it may be. And in that scenario, it's a lot easier to go and implement a kind of governance strategy and be really efficient. But the trade-off in that is that you're losing autonomy at the individual group level, so to a certain extent. On the flip side, you have a lot of universities where every faculty is their own fiefdom. They have their own web budgets, and kind of the perennial problem that we run into is that each one of them might have kind of a small budget for web. And if you were to add all those up, it's actually quite a large, substantial budget. You can do some very interesting things with it. But if every faculty has 20 grand to go and spend on their website and want to maintain that, and they're doing a lot of things themselves, you start to run into some challenges there. And in that case, you might have a play where you could go and come in and say, well, can we pool some of those funds, and maybe you're not going to go and work together in a central IT manner, but maybe we can go and fund some development of the commonality. So looking across the different parts of the organization and say, well, what are the things that we all need? So every school is going to go and have a common look and feel. Can we go and implement that as a Drupal theme? Is there a kind of centralized logic SSO provider? Do we have a common analytics provider? Start to go and bake in those layers into kind of distribution or starting point. So when I say distribution, that's a really kind of Drupal thing. Everyone understands what that means. Questions on that? Okay, I see heads nodding. So you're packing together all of it into a repeatable, centrally managed distribution that can be deployed in many different scenarios. So I think that's kind of definitely one of the governance keys, is to go and look at how the organization is structured and make sense of it. And sometimes that actually means fighting the political battles to realign that organization. That's usually a lot less about the technology than how the organization functions itself. Any questions that we're going through this? Does that sound familiar to maybe the 200 sites?
So next we'll talk a little bit about managing code.
Yeah, so, they would say that how you go and you deploy a Drupal-based application, doesn't necessarily, matter. The user is going to still like to go and get the same experience, whether that's using kind of Drupal multi-site installation where you have one install of Drupal that has many databases underneath of it and they're empowering multiple different domains versus having each one of those be independent but essentially still the same code that's deployed. So that's not necessarily, I think, what matters. But there's multiple ways to go and approach this. So for the independent code bases, there's some asterisks there in terms of what you can go and do with the independent code bases. So is this a really free form organization where every single group has their code base they're managing independently and there's no interconnectivity between those? Or are you starting to go and get into some reuse? And so that can be in the form of kind of a common upstream Git repository. Not sure if there's any, our friends from Pantheon here, but their kind of platform when they're managing many sites kind of piggybacks off of Git and how it works, where you can go and have one Git repository. You can go and have it have that be upstream from others, and so you can go and have an upstream branch that you're tracking, pull in all those code changes, but still have your own local modifications. Another way to go and do this without getting into version control itself comes down to dependency management and using tools like Composer, which we'll be getting into a little bit, where maybe you're not going and having an upstream repository, but it may be easy as updating a version number in your Composer file that allows you to go and pull in all the releases from a centralized location.
We also have another customer that we recently released our version of a pipeline management tool similar to Jenkins or Travis. And they're using that pipeline management as a way to run some validation tests that when new code is pushed out to a site, that it won't break the overall rules that they have. So they're using pipeline management as a way to govern what code gets pushed.
Yeah, and then again, Drupal multi-site, so when you have that one installation of Drupal that's powering many sites, there's automation tools around that. One that's been around for a long time in various forms is a project called Acquia. So what it would do is automate a lot of the manual work that we'd have to go and do with Drupal multi-site. So if you're looking at under the hood of Drupal multi-site, what it is, you have kind of folder directory structure that aligns kind of one-to-one with the sites that are within that multi-site, and you might have site-specific modules, site-specific themes, and it can be kind of a pain to go and manage that sometimes. You're just going to keep track of what's running, run database updates can get a little bit more tricky in these situations. So Acquia helps automate that. My understanding of the project at the moment is it's going through a lot of changes where there's on Acquia 2 right now, and they're going to move to Acquia 3, which is a completely different architecture. So it's kind of, I'm not sure if anyone happens to know the status of that, but it's interesting to go and track how they're trying to evolve that project itself. It was spun out of a company called Bright and then moved on to development seed that became Mapbox. And so it's kind of an interesting history to track the lineage of what's been going on with Acquia. Then Acquia Cloud Site Factory, our product, it's very similar to Acquia in a lot of things that it's doing, where you can go and insert your own Drupal code base, and it will manage spinning up new sites. It will manage the updates if you want to go and do a new release, and maybe that release will trigger an update script and maybe running 1,000 sites. And do you want to go and take down 1,000 sites into maintenance mode at the same time, and then take each one back online individually as you run an update script? You probably want to go and have a better way to go and do that. So Site Factory will take care of that. It'll take care of issues around who can go and access what site, and just having a common centralized dashboard. So it's going to be an add-on that makes multi-site a lot better. Sometimes we get some pushback when we talk about multi-site. Like, what are some of the downsides? And I'd say there are some downsides to go mitigate. One of those is resource isolation. So imagine a scenario where you do have one site that's under attack, and you see a massive traffic spike. That neighbor will start to go and impact other neighbors, and so it's definitely something to go and be aware of. But if you think about it, it's also similar to any SaaS application that's running out there. You're having to go and deal with that noisy neighbor syndrome, and it's, I like to go and talk about having your eggs in one basket, but that's a really nice, really strong basket, and that can sometimes be more stable than trying to go and have your eggs in multiple different baskets that might fall over and break, right? So it's just kind of different philosophy around that. It's no different than most SaaS applications. The other thing we hear is just what we were talking about just a moment ago about updating sites, one by one. That can be a bit of a painful process if you don't have automation around that. That's kind of a problem that we solved. In terms of pros, I do think there's something to be said about forcing consistency across an organization. There's many times where we've talked to organizations and they have disparate code bases and they have some strategy of how they govern those, but it starts to fall off the rails where there might be 10 sites here that have been fully on track, don't have local modifications, whereas there's another group of 10 sites that have fallen behind on their updates. So there's some you're getting into your site, or they've made local modifications that have started to go and break the release when going to pull that in. And so I think there is something to be said about forced consistency across site and having that rigidity if the sites are common enough that it allows for that. You get to a certain point where if you do have kind of a group of sites that are similar to each other and you have some outliers, sites that are a little bit different, I don't think you'd want to go and put them into that model. That might be a case where you have a mixed environment where you have say you have a multi-site running for many microsites and sites that have a ton of similarity, and then you have your say an intranet, right? You might be able to go and inherit some of the single sign-on and some of the look and feel, but it's a fundamentally different type of application. It doesn't make sense to go and shove that into the microsite. Go and split that off and you can have a mixed environment. And the last kind of pro will say is just it can be very resource efficient. So we hear this in EDU a lot of time. We have some EDU customers that are running into the thousands of sites, and these might be sites for individual faculty members that might see 50 hits in a month. So if you were to go and deploy that site independently, you're going to go and have a dedicated PHP procs for that. You might have some overhead if you're running that in a container or a VM. And when you're running into these scenarios where you have hundreds or thousands of sites, all with very low traffic, that in itself can start to really pile up the amount of hardware you're running. So if you're thinking of 256 megabytes of RAM for kind of Drupal PHP process and some other overhead for operating system or things running, times that by 1,000, you start to come into some serious hardware. Whereas if you have that on Drupal multi-site, all in one big bucket, it kind of naturally balances itself out and be very resource efficient. Any questions? So kind of case study of like real world, how do you deal with some of these issues, kind of strategies you can have. Prior to Acquia, the gig I had directly with Acquia was working for a company called Dennis Publishing out in the UK. They're a magazine publisher, about 40 different magazine brands. They picked up a lot of those brands during the Great Recession, and they were trying to go consolidate how they approached digital. So they're standardizing on Drupal, and between all these different magazines, there were a lot of similarities. So things like image galleries or tagging systems. They would have social media integration. So what we did is we took a look at all these different properties. Well, what are the commonalities? What should we go and build into kind of standardized distribution? And what are the things that are going to be different on a per site basis? So a really good example of this would be the site carbuyer.co.uk. The primary feature of Carbuyer is it has a massive database of every single make and model of vehicle and everything that all the specs for that. And so you can go and choose your price range, choose what you want in the vehicle, and it will go and kind of drill down into exactly what you want. That's going to be something that you only ever want for the car buyer site, but that car buyer site still has to meet your image galleries. So we start to go and get into, what can we inherit and what can we not inherit. The strategy we ended up taking was that we've had eventual consistency. So we built out the distribution and we launched that first with 2 sites. And then we started developing on the third site. Well, what are the things that we need for this site that are not in that distribution? And when we ran into one of those features, say, well, is this something that should be reusable across the board, or is this something that's going to be standalone? And we actually did not go and immediately backport that feature. We would go and launch the site, burn it in for a few weeks, and then we'd have a kind of strategy of eventual consistency where we'd say, okay, well, some sites we'd go and hold back, a release or so just for the practicality of, upgrade paths and whatnot, and we would go back for those features that end up being common. I think one of the biggest challenges about trying to, provide some sort of code reuse in centralized government is that it's really, really difficult to absolutely nail it from the get-go with, what the content structure could be across these sites, how the features are going to be developed. And so you're going to find that you will have to go and make some changes and adaptations as you go. And there's some challenges around the upgrade path for that. So something to be kind of, aware of and build in as you're putting together your strategy. It's kind of speaking to kind of another use case we see all the time. This is within education as an example, but I think this is applicable anywhere. You can go into Adidas or Nike and have exactly the same type of conversation. So when you're starting off and you're developing your distribution, it's the kind of concept of inheritance. So it's called peeling back the onion into the layers, right? So start with Drupal core. Of course, we're kind of advocates for Acquia Lightning or as a starting point where it will go and provide some things like media management capabilities and content editorial workflow, panels, panelizer, content, scheduled content publishing. A lot of things that really Drupal probably should have in Drupal core. It's kind of good standards to go and start with, and you can kind of build your distribution on top of that and look at what the commonalities are. So I always put the SEO tools, like maybe you're putting in meta tag and XML, sitemap, you have your single sign-on, default roles, if you have common roles across the organization, and maybe those sync up with your SSO system, put that into your distro. One of the patches that we have within Lightning, something that's been worked on for Drupal core for, I think it's 2011 now, which is the concept of distribution inheritance. So you can have one distribution that is inheriting the kind of features and structure of another, the modules that are being used. So that's something that, we hope that gets into Drupal core fairly soon. But right now, Lightning does have that concept, and in the presentation, we'll send this out afterwards. There's some links on that. But anyhow, you have your distribution. And then when you deploy that out, you look at, well, maybe you have the faculty sites that would be deployed in kind of multi-site environment in Site Factory. And there could be some, additional code that you might have that's specific for the faculty site. So one of those that we put in there, I say the Site Factory connector module. So just one of the implementation details around Site Factory is that you run some modules that ping back into the central Site Factory interface that will allow for some single sign-on and capabilities for the centralized dashboard. But then you might have your primary EE or your .com for it's outside of education, where you could have your own contrib code or custom code that's needed specifically for features on that site, and then you have things like say a library site or your intranet, those types of examples that are their own site snowflakes that sit outside of the kind of multi-site environment. So this is not at all uncommon when we're dealing with many of our larger customers. All right, should we talk about Nestle a little bit, or is it?
I think we got time. It's 25, so why don't we dive into it a little bit, just maybe quickly?
Yeah, I mean,
so,
go ahead.
No, okay.
Yes, I mean, I think Nestle is kind of a good example of this and how they've approached it. They have Site Factory in use for a lot of their brand sites, but they still do have additional sites that are kind of fall out of that mold. NASDAQ is another really interesting example that we work with, where you have all this kind of corporate information sites. So if you're looking at any publicly traded companies, they all have investor relations sites, and you can imagine there's a lot of visibility there, and it's kind of good use case for a Site Factory or multi-site type of installation.
NASDAQ is a great example where regulation comes into play. It's more than just making sure you have a consistent way to manage your code, but also there's certain rules that need to apply when you're talking about an investor relations site to meet compliance for things like SOX. So this is a way for NASDAQ to provide investor relations sites that they know meet those standards. It makes it much easier for them to sell.
I know that Pfizer, very similar, heavily regulated industry. Whenever they make a change on one of those sites, they'd actually have to go and generate a PDF of that change and then send it through their legal review. And it used to be that due to all the regulations for them to go and spin up the site, it might take months just because of all that regulation and red tape. But if they're able to go and essentially, have their one multi-site instance go through that process and become validated, then spinning up a new experience on that automatically kicks off those check boxes because it's considered a single application. So I think it's probably a little redundant. Yeah, I think it's a little bit redundant. I think it kind of points to a real world example. It's similar to the kind of EU example given where they have kind of two site factory instances. So we have a kind of concept called stacks. So you can think of stacks as a hosting cluster. So physical hardware that is situated in an AWS region somewhere worldwide that has a code base associated with it. So imagine your government organization, you're a longtime Drupal user, and you have all of your Drupal 7 sites, but now you're going and moving on to your Drupal 8 sites. You have to spin up an additional stack, and when you're spinning up the site, say, well, should this be on the Drupal 7 or Drupal 8 code base? You have multiple different installation profiles. You can go and get to that level of granularity. It might be a use case if you're a kind of global corporation where you want to be able to spin up, use hardware that's in EMEA versus the US. All right, so Composer. Does anyone use Composer here? All right. Does everyone like Composer? Yeah?
Okay.
I think it's been not in Drupal 7.
Yeah.
Yeah, not in Drupal 7, yeah. I've never tried that with Drupal 7.
Like.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's been interesting to go and watch kind of Composer and how that's evolved. I remember at first I was very confused about how the hell do I use this thing? What is the best practice? And I think that's really gotten straightened out in the past year or so. I think one thing I'll kind of point out here is just kind of starting off kind of a new project, kind of the idea that you have your distribution that has your Composer JSON file with all the dependencies being managed, et cetera, then having a kind of a secondary kind of Git repo that you can go and start off as your essentially your project template, which makes it super easy to go and get started with kind of best practices in mind. So if you're looking at using Drupal and Composer, there's a lot of little things about modules go here, this is where libraries go, et cetera, and to go and get all that set up correctly on your own is a bit of a pain. But using kind of a project template can really help. So there's some kind of generic Drupal project templates out there, and Lightning distribution kind of uses those as its baseline. So to get started, once you have Composer installed, it's like literally as easy as that one-liner on the top, and that will give you kind of your own local code base, and then and Composer dependencies kind of depend on Lightning, and then that will get all Lightning's dependencies and follow that tree all the way through. For those who haven't used Composer, kind of drush commands that are equivalent, but looks like most folks have jumped on the kind of Composer train at this point. And that's the sub-profile hash that we're tracking for many years at this point. And if you kind of go to that link around Lightning and kind of some sub-profiles, will have some documentation on specific steps that you need to do to use the kind of sub-profile inheritance. It's pretty straightforward to go and get going on that. And what I'd say with Composer, and the kind of interesting thing about it is that I used to really focus on kind of Git and inheriting Git branches as a way to go and manage code. I think now with Composer, it's a lot easier to go and do. If you just have kind of your Composer project, have that as a dependency, to change that kind of one-liner to update the latest version. I think it's a lot cleaner. And I think as long as you have kind of a build process in place to create actual artifacts that you're going to deploy, it's the better way to do it. All right, so what about content? So we talk a lot about code, but what about the actual content of the site? And something as simple as you have your copyright, text, and that needs to be the same across all the different sites, or maybe you have news and events that need to be distributed across many sites. How do you go and deal with those types of challenges? Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what the example we're using with the healthcare company before, content going through that med-reg process for Pfizer, for example, they have to do that every couple of years to make sure that the copy they have meets the fair balance. You know, when you see a pharma commercial and it says, here's all the side effects, and they do it in that same tone and voice that they say, oh, this is going to make you feel great, but it might kill you. They have that they have to do it in all their sites, all their marketing copy, everything. And they have regular lawyers and doctors that go and review and make sure they're being accurate, and they expire. So when that content expires, if they leave it up there, the FDA will come knocking with a fine for them. So managing your content for them can be a very expensive prospect. So, and this is really, I worked with pharma for a number of years, and working with the brands, this is how it used to work. It was this crazy. It didn't make any sense. It was a lot of hand-wringing and chasing things to try to get it all ready through. Does it have the right approval? Have we put it in the CMS? Is it in the digital asset management system? Et cetera, et cetera. And are all the dates correct? Do they match? And it was matching paper copies to what was in the system.
Yeah. So I think, you know, just based on time and honestly, like lack of ourselves being any sort of subject matter experts on this, I think we're really going to punt around content strategy and what to do there. I would actually recommend, you know, looking at some literature, hiring some strategists.
I think really the content portion of projects that Chapter 3 has been dealing with for many years, quite honestly, is the most complicated part of the whole project. The multi-site setup and the templates are great, but ultimately what we have found is that when you start dealing with content, the whole process moves out of the IT role, or the role, whatever it is, the marketing role, and begins to move over the fence into the business units.
Yeah.
And nobody knows how business units are going to respond, right? And so this part of it, just for people who are thinking about doing this, this part does take a fair amount of long-term work, and this is where it gets real super tricky, because businesses that haven't spent a lot of time on their content, generally when they start looking at their content deeply, they begin to realize how terrible it is. Like, it's really terrible, right? And they want to ditch it all. Then they got to rewrite it all. They don't have anybody to write it, right? And so it really creates a quandary.
They've heard the same thing many different times.
Yeah, you know, it's like it creates this huge quandary when the process of it is like, we're going to standardize your website. And then all of a sudden, standardization of a website starts to turn into standardization of look and feel. We agree on that. And then all of a sudden, the ball starts rolling down that content path.
Yeah.
And, you know, projects, depending on the client team, could either be awesome, kind of awesome, painful, super painful, or project just blows up.
Yep.
Right? Because, I mean, people just don't know. They don't know. And, like, the manager can't tell his manager, hey, we got to rewrite like 2/3 of the stuff that, wait, our communication is not clear, right? And so this is something to really super consider. Content is always the most complicated part.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think the only project I can think of where it really had it together was actually in town was Autodesk. I think we don't talk about this, but showed up there, and when you start talking about taxonomy, the one said, oh yeah, let's bring in our, you know, our digital librarian, and we have a tool specifically for managing taxonomies and relationships between them, all the way down to, you know, what are the common key commands across our applications for different application versions and different systems. We had the entire thing, you know, kind of completely thought out. So I think it's the only case I can think of where this was worked out. But
that was clearly the outlier.
Clearly the outlier. So only time I can ever think of that. But yeah, John's right. It comes down to, you know, doing an inventory of these things, talking to the different groups, you know, playing around with the kind of data models before you get started with development, and working out, is this a structure that works for us, or different ways that we can go and approach this, where the taxonomies and whatnot.
I'd like to add that it's not that, you know, the teams have a lack of desire to do it right, but it comes down to a lot of times a lack of time and budget, because rewriting your content is a big undertaking. So sometimes the market moves faster than you can update, and that's going to always be a challenge, which is why it's good to have some great people behind you with that.
Yeah, so I mean, in this the theme of kind of punting on this. Great podcast.
We can't cover content.
Yeah. Okay. But, the podcast on this, fantastic book by Lisa Welshman. I think she's presented at DrupalCon, but for 15 or for the past, as kind of consultant, kind of expert in this space. I think definitely worthwhile to go and, look at some of the resources out there. So, I think from the technology side, one of the pieces for this can be content syndication or APIs. Try and keep this a little bit generic rather than say like Acquia product specific. One of the big trends that we've seen has been with the rise of different content distribution channels and headless applications has been, do we have kind of centralized authoring environment, and then we have kind of API around this. And you probably noticed that there have been some distributions coming out specifically to solve this problem and kind of getting started with a headless environment. So I do think that that's part of it, is thinking about, can you have an API first content strategy? From the product side, we kind of recognize this is an issue, and product out kind of content hub that will handle kind of content syndication between many different sites. And the model for that really depends on your organization. So if you're really kind of centrally controlled organization, you can have a model like this where you would have authoring environment, and that would go and push out the content to all the spokes. I would say more real world, it's almost like a little bit more like this, kind of can be distributed. So, if we're taking kind of EDU as a perennial example, do you have faculty sites that are adding their own calendar events and news? They're likely going and doing that on the individual sites themselves, and likely for good reason. That's where they're working every day. But can you go and push that content into kind of a hub where that's then distributed back to the primary EDU? You might have a workflow where those sites are paying back to a centralized authoring site that's used for kind of the primary EDU or .com, and we synchronize those nodes across as unpublished content, and that would trigger a workflow in the sites for kind of a manual review if you want to go and have someone deciding what events are prominent enough to go and feature. Another way you might do it is you have them syndicating through and use kind of tags or taxonomies to state which piece of content should or should not be published based off of the taxonomy rules. But in all of this, it becomes really imperative that you thought through your content types and taxonomy to be as consistent as possible, or else it starts to really kind of get muddled up. All right, so Site Factory.
Yeah, I think.
Talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, this is our bit of shameless promotion. So, Site Factory really is what Acquia's way of solving some of the challenges with multi-site. Rick covered a little earlier the pros and cons, and stated pretty well that we think in many use cases multi-site outweighs the cons with the pros. But there's still some more that's needed to actually manage and govern this, because more and more we're seeing that the business units themselves want to get their hands in on things, but they maybe don't have the technical staff to actually get things done. So now you have a ton of non-technical people asking you to do things. Site Factory helps solve some of that by allowing more people to become site builders without really having to manage the heavy lifting on the back end. Using APIs and things, you can have more site managers going into a dashboard, understanding what's going on, and then deploying stacks. If you're a global company, you may want to have stacks in different regions. A lot of reasons for that right now is data residency. It matters where the data is stored, and it's going to matter in very expensive ways in Europe in another year. So it's important to remember that as we're deploying, if we're collecting information, especially about European citizens who reside in Europe, in 2018, there's a regulation going into play that can cost you, I think, up to 20% of your annual turnover. So big, huge fines. And Site Factory is the one way that we can do that. Content delivery networks and things like that can help you along that way. But, in terms of our value proposition, why something like this makes sense when you're doing multi-site, have some sort of centralized way to build and manage sites, it comes down to focusing on what you really want to do is build great applications, reducing costs, and having something that's a lot easier to manage at scale. Yeah.
All right.
Now, the important stuff.
Some real world kind of, show you how some of this works and see how we do for time, and definitely got lots of time. Good. Let's make this more comfortable. One of the joys of Zoom is I can sit in the audience and project that here while you're listening. All right. So what I'm going to look at is kind of site factory interface. And so conceptually, what we're looking at here is the site is organized into groups. Groups are both a way of organizing the site themselves into logical groupings that are easy to find, as well as a way to go and access control those sites. So imagine that you have roles and kind of users within the site factory themselves. So you kind of can look through here. We have all our groups, and decide what roles they have within the organization, and then from there, what groups are those users a part of, and that would govern which sites that they can go and log into. So it's kind of an SSO element for organizations that use SAML. That's been something that we've deployed with customers now, where it actually can synchronize this in with a single sign-on system for your organization. So kind of a marketer who might be working with 50 sites can go and log in, and they see only their 50 sites, have kind of centralized dashboard for that. Maybe kind of two examples. UNICEF is a kind of client. This is a simple, simplified, like fake version for kind of a site factory demo instance. But you might have some high-level sites for India and Brazil, and a separate group for Morocco, and we have kind of a law corporation. So imagine you are an organization that creates sites for lawyers, right? And maybe you have thousands of those sites. Kind of group those into the overall law firm and individual the lawyers underneath that, and that might be your structure. If we're looking at the groups on the side here, notice how we have the number of users associated with that group. So if we go and say, okay, the users that we have down on the bottom here, like Jonathan and Caitlin, we have access to everything under this umbrella group. But then if we drill down to new demo group, it's a great naming convention there, we might add additional users into that group. So now,
those are users of Cloud Site Factory or Drupal?
Those are for the users for the accounts up here, or?
Yeah, those users are they?
Yeah, so those are site factory users. Now, when you go to click into the site for the first time, there's going to be a handshake between the site factory and the Drupal site to go and create that user, and we'll handle pass off login to the site factory itself, the default configuration. So we'll kind of create the Drupal users on the back end and keep those two in sync. And so if we said, okay, suddenly Jonathan is no longer with the organization, we block his account, we block access to all the Drupal sites as well. Is that anything? That's right. All right. So kind of interesting thing with Site Factory, you can decide how you want to go and create new experiences, new sites. So when I'm within a group, I can just hit create new site, and then we have the different stacks. This would be the different geographical regions. It could be that you have kind of Drupal 7 starting point, or you have kind of Drupal 8 starting point. Kind of select that starting point here, and I can go and say SF Doug demo. Give your site and the URL and create that site. And what this will do is we'll kind of do the initial installation of the site, and when you kind of come back to it, you can run through the rest of the installation kind of steps. It takes a little bit, so send me an email once that's done. The other way that you can go and approach it is you can go and have one of the sites be your starting point. So maybe I'll go into I'll go back to this log group here. And so maybe there's a particular site here that is very similar to the one that you're going to be creating. You want to just start off with essentially a copy of that database, copy of all that content. You can go and use that as your starting point. And so I can just scroll down, hit duplicate site, and then we have the option of do I want to go and copy absolutely everything as is, consider a full site clone, or do we want to go and scrub that database a little bit, which would go and get rid of the site-specific content, site users, et cetera, before you kind of clone that. So let's go to ASF.2 and say, okay, I'm going to go and create a clean copy, which will, leave all, say, the user roles, all the content that was created first by the main users, but everything that's created by other users on the site would be wiped out. But you kind of keep all the module configuration, et cetera. Just go and kind of duplicate a site. And so there's kind of different ways that you can go and manage those sites. Underneath the hood, this is tied into to regular Acquia cloud. And so if I go to this kind of environment here, so this is the kind of underlying cloud subscription for for the site factory. And as I take actions within the environment, we'd actually kind of see it in a log here. And there's a Git repository that is associated with the site factory that I have access to here. Snappy. Oh, there we go. So kind of the Git repository. So any code changes that I have that I make and kind of commit into that Git repository would be available for new deployment. So if I go under administration and go to update code, so what I can go and do here is say, okay, for stack 1 or stack 2, you can go and choose the kind of version control path. So I want to go and deploy this new tag that I just pushed up into the Git repository. You can select that tag, and you have the option to go and schedule this in. And one of the really interesting things that will happen behind the scenes is you want to go and have the minimal maintenance window, smallest maintenance window as possible, least downtime as possible. And so we'll spin up a secondary copy of the multi-site code base, and then we'll move the vhost or the domain over one by one between those, and we'll move one over. We'll go and run update DB, kind of update script. We'll validate that site's back online, and then we'll move over to the next and move the vhost pointer to the secondary Docker that we've just spun up, which allows us to go and solve that problem of multi-site, where if you make a change that affects all the sites at the same time, if you have to run a database update, that can be very painful. We'll just kind of automate all that away. And so if I go to over to the kind of task log, we'd see everything that is kind of queued up and running across the site factory. So we see how where it's doing all the work for us. Any questions around this so far? All right. So I think that kind of gives you the idea, kind of site factory and how it works. Typically we have a mixed environment where, for sites that are very similar to each other and fit into that mold, they might live within site factory. For others, they live deployed elsewhere, kind of standalone code bases. But the mix and match approach comes in where both of them may have the same upstream Drupal distribution that's specific to your organization. And so that's kind of where we're trying to go maximize the amount of reuse possible in those environments. So I think that's all that we have in terms of structured content, but we're happy to talk through any of this. Usually the conversation is actually most interesting.
Do you have, so how would you do sort of like a sort of dev stage production model in the factory?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say for Site Factory, it works well for microsites, but you just have to kind of be careful about how you're doing this. So what you'd have is you can go and clone a site and say that this clone is part of the same collection. So essentially, it is another version of the same site, and you might be doing your kind of configuration for the next release of that, and you have that in a state where you're happy with it. You can go and hit make primary, which will switch which version of that site is associated with the production domain. So it's nice and simple for a marketer type, but it does have the downside that if it's a site that has user-generated content, users logging into it, and you've taken a long time to make that change, kind of blow that away. So you do need to be careful with it. Where we're going with this is that Drupal 8 and the configuration API, it opens up a lot of of possibilities where we can go and capture configuration that's been done on a particular site and just apply those configuration changes rather than go and just kind of, swap the database, which is, the whole point of the configuration management. So there's some really nice opportunities there, I think.
So from your side, Site Factory is still optimized for smaller microsites. And it's going to be optimized for Drupal 8 eventually. Like right now, it's sort of using a Drupal 7 model for managing microsites. And then the next release, it'll be using more of the CMI that sort of set Drupal 8 into this new arena of managing multiple sites.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, the first phase of Drupal 8 support was just getting Drupal 8 running and working out single sign-ons and stuff. Previously it was using OpenID underneath the hood. OpenID module is no longer there. So, working out issues like that. And then, the next phase is, utilizing CMI to solve some of the configuration management problems. I actually think it's a huge opportunity around, consistency and reporting on site. So we have, something called insights that will look at the configuration on a site, report back on the site health roughly based off of common problems that we see where, maybe they turned off caching entirely or, running a module we really shouldn't in production. Catching those types of things. I think next phase of that's going to be looking at configuration across all the sites. And, before you roll an update that makes a configuration change globally, say what is the actual value across all these sites right now and what's the impact going to be? To answer the other question around fit for Site Factory, I think that's an interesting one. You can still go and have a workflow for the sites where, you still have access to the database, underneath, and you can go and run any drush command that you want, kind of come up with your own workflows if you do have, sites that have the user-generated, content, and you can, this type of model for updates doesn't work. So I would say it isn't strictly tied to microsites. We do have some, like looking at the investor relations sites for NASDAQ or the Pfizer brand sites. We're starting to get away from, what I consider a kind of like a campaign microsite as a throwaway. But there definitely are those limitations to think through.
Cool.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you debug anything, because, if you're saying you're spinning up Docker containers and you're not able to really SSH and get in there, and one of the reasons, I've never really gone with Acquia or Pantheon is as I've helped people. It's like when they're finally stuck, if they can't reach someone at the organization, they don't have any tools. You can't get in there, you can't install a search, you can't, configure, SAML or anything.
Right, yeah,
so it's like, what do you do?
It's kind of, I think with a platform as a service type of model, there's a certain amount of control that you are giving up. Like we're not going to say, have at it and, here's access to the package manager for Ubuntu, right? Because that's just going to cause consistency issues across our install base and cause more problems than that helps. But we do open up probably more access than you're likely to expect. Like we do have, full SSH access where you can go and get into.
It's not like Terminus where you're kind of stuck.
No, it's not like Terminus. Yeah, it's a little bit different. I mean, a lot of it's just based off of the model. Like I think, containers are fantastic and have some huge advantages, but there are also things that you have to work around or come with interesting solutions to manage if you're, versus having the VMs there that are more traditional.
So if you had to write a module, let's say that, use maybe the Drupal 8 REST API and went somewhere else and pulled some data in, you could do all that here, or is there like a
I don't see any. I don't see any real limitations for what you're stating. I mean, it's full non-root SSH access. Have whatever workflow you want. There's an API for cloud. So we have folks who have strung it together with their own Jenkins instance to take actions. There's.
And if you really get stuck, how much is like the support?
What you're asking is probably not. There's different support packages. Different levels. Different price points have different support levels. Keep it at that. Maybe talk after. But I mean, in terms of like scripting different options, I mean, there's full REST API for site factory, there's kind of API behind that where you take the same action. Cloud hooks, I like to go and talk up where, like imagine a scenario where it's like as simple as you want to go and post a message into, a Slack room when a deployment's been made, or say when you're copying the database over from production to dev, you want to go and scrub the database down to give it a more manageable size, or get rid of PII, like personally identifiable information. Where CloudX comes in is just a directory structure that you put your bash scripts in. So if you want something to only run in dev, get the dev folder, and then within that, say whenever I update the DB or copy the DB across, any bash script that you have in the directory will automatically be called. So it's really straightforward and it's very powerful in what you can do. And we have like some samples here, like the Slack or HipChat, or if you want to log an event and run if you're using that, and have your environment variables to go and start, and that just pipes it into Drush to run that action on the DB or execute those SQL commands.
What is it on the back end? Is it Aurora?
Aurora, no, it's we have our own AMIs that are set up. So we're not using Aurora or RDS. Some of that is because when we set it up, it predated RDS, but we're doing it at a large enough scale that makes sense for us to go and have our own AMIs that we have control of, and it's Percona's version of MySQL.
So what if someone needs like a site with Shibboleth or like a shopping cart, is that a service?
Shibboleth is supported. So
Is that something you configure, or is that something?
So clients can configure for like the SAML integration. We do have since it's common, we can go and do that for clients and just walk through it. We also have documentation where it can be.
You can do it yourself if you want.
Yeah. So that answers the question.
Does the site factory doesn't care if any of this repos it's dealing with are multi-site setup, or is it assuming that they're all like an upstream distro?
Yeah, it's essentially it will take over the site's directory for you and create all.
Oh, I see. So it's at that level.
Yeah. So you might have it where you have like a distribution that you're deploying elsewhere outside of site factory, and then you have like a site factory version of that just adds in the connector modules that will kind of take over from there with actual installations of the sites and managing the folder structure.
If you have to patch something that's in the distro, you got to find some other way to do that.
No, you can patch it. Yeah, you can go and patch it within the distro. So if I'm looking at this environment here, any change it makes to that Git repository is now available within Site Factory to deploy.
Okay.
So it's not like it forces you to use a certain code base. You bring your own code base to it. But yeah, it used to be that way where the genesis of it was a SaaS product called Gardens, where it had its own distribution, but kind of realized that was dumb. It makes sense to bring your own distros for the use cases.
And a non-technical question about with multi-sites and distros and rolling those out, the challenge I've had is getting all of the stakeholders on board and not just totally rejecting it, even if you involve them early on. They sometimes when it comes to actually entering their content will be like, I feel defined, or I feel whatever by the box that they're basically putting.
Right.
And so when we work with governments who have departments, or when we work with schools or universities that have departments as well, how have you guys gone about making sure that they're all satisfied?
Right. So I would say when you say you guys, so I've never worked in Acquia on professional services projects. Luckily I haven't had to deal with that at Acquia, but I think the experience at Dennis was very, if you look over to the side of you. But at Dennis, that was a lot of it, where you do have to go and have the conversations with the stakeholders and say, bring them into the room if you can, and see how you can go and work that out. And Dennis, a lot of the conversation was around, can we have common taxonomies across multiple sites? Because there's advantages to having a tagged taxonomy or a taxonomy that was for the primary structure. Because when it came to that distribution that was deployed everywhere, that allowed us to roll out new features that relied on that that, you know, kind of shared vocabulary. But, you know, some groups want to start to go outside of that, and so we would, you know, sometimes it came down to, you know, no, you cannot go and do that. And the reason why is because it's going to slow down everything else that we're doing, and that's one of the reasons why we can go and give you all these nice, shiny new features that you would never get, because it's like getting off of that hamster wheel where you're constantly fighting unique fires across so many different sites and moving it more to like a product development type of model. But then on the per site basis, we would go in and be able to go and be additive to that. So kind of the key being, it's okay to be additive, but don't start screwing around with things that are supposed to be standard, because that's when you start to really get into the problems.
So I have a question, kind of an extension of that is, how easy would it be with Site Factory or otherwise to take a site that is part of a multi-site and say, you know, they do have new requirements and be able to branch that off and say, okay, this is no longer a multi-site?
That's a really good question. That's very straightforward to go and do. So you can go and just grab the database. You already, you know, that code's already portable. So you know, move your file directory, your DB, and that.
So is it all manual, or is there like an actual like button you can click in Site Factory?
You know what? I have not tried this for like about 4 or 5 years, but there definitely was a eject button, right? And that would go and give you everything in one package. I don't know. I honestly don't know if we still have that button there. At one point, it absolutely was there. Once more of the fast version.
Right.
But either way, it's absolutely possible. There's nothing like really funky that we're doing that would mean you can't transfer a site out and do whatever you want with it.
Okay. Cool.
And I mean, ultimately, we're kind of going with this is that, you know, Site Factory has kind of interesting history and how it evolved, but you know, ultimately, it's, you kind of see it as a feature of cloud, right? And so, you know, the UI that you see for, you know, Site Factory with all the sites is something that will converge into the Acquia Cloud UI. Those things will be a lot more unified. Already under the hood, it's using the same, you know, kind of infrastructure and APIs, but the UI is have separate login at the moment. That will all get unified together.
Okay. So,
yeah,
extension of that. So let's say if I have a separate site. So let's say, okay, this year I'm gonna move this site out from the factory, but next year, oh, we don't have the funding for that external site anymore. We want to bring it. After all this customization was done, within this year, want to bring it back to
so with the customizations, if you want to have the per site customization, that's something that's purposely not supported. Essentially saying that if to go and fit into that model, we're saying that there is not per site code changes to kind of have that like the tight governance around it. So unless you incorporated those changes into the distribution that's being used for Site Factory across all sites, that's not going to be.
So there's a pretty big difference between this and Acquia.
Yes, because Acquia does allow you to have per site code, and that was like some philosophical, long-running debates within Acquia as to whether or not you should support site-specific code. The only site-specific code that is allowed is site theme. So you can go and connect in a separate Git repository for the site theme, and that will be used, but site-specific module is not allowed within Site Factory.
So this thing really works well with an organization that has a standardized template of some sort. They've done all of this work, or they've done something, I mean, you know, like, I don't know, Pfizer with all of their little drug sites or whatever, you know what I mean? They're all kind of the same, they got a different fee. That's about the extent of the changes on them, you know, maybe some functionality that's actually the same across all of them, but maybe some use them, some don't, you know,
right,
or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good thing to point out. Like, you know, you can go and have features that are optional, not just enabling a module or not, but, you know, if you're really trying to go modify it, or, you know, that model breaks down at a certain.
So you can add features to this?
But that,
Once you get your template rolling, you can add features that'll get rolled out across the sites?
yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and depending on the site, you can choose which ones have the feature and which ones don't. So for companies and edu and even cities that are at scale, you know, that they have lots of sites that they're running, it gives them the flexibility that they need without having 100 snowflakes that they're managing. It's just one snowball.
All else fails, you can do whatever you want to theme too, so.
Yeah, you can go and have theme, and I mean, I don't recommend this. We have clients that start to say, well, you know, what I can go and do is we do support N number of installation profiles. So if you really want to go and get tricky, essentially, just have it as an installation profile only running for that site. That's kind of silly, but it is possible. I'd say that the better use case for that is if you have kind of variations off of the same overall type of structure or idea, then I think the separate installation profiles could have a place, but I'd say generally, you would want to stay away from that.
I don't know if this is off topic or not, but you mentioned if you had a whole bunch of sites that wanted to share content and everyone talked about making a headless architecture, is there any alternates? Let's say you don't really want to build a headless architecture, but you do want to have something better than, you know, RSS, syndication, or...
Yeah, I mean, Drupal has some pretty solid laws on this where, I mean, you know, having detailed architecture does have a lot of trade-offs just in terms of, you know, all kinds of things get more difficult and more technical. You know, you're not going to enable that module and suddenly the UI comes with it. So I think that there's definitely a place to go and have a normal headed Drupal site that, you know, have, you know, services, REST, you know, enabled on it to go and feed into other experiences. But when it comes to the actual, like, Drupal site, it's still, you know, normal Drupal without it being helpful. So kind of like separate out the, like, JavaScript front end for Drupal site use case from just having a normal Drupal site that will publish an API.
But it's hard in terms of the content floating from one site to the other, I mean, to avoid, no duplication.
Yeah, I mean, you can, I'm trying to remember the most popular. Well, there's a specific Drupal module, I'm trying to remember the name of it. Deploy, yes, yeah. So I mean, like, that is a use case for deploy. There are changes in Drupal 8 that make that more straightforward in terms of, like, standard serialization libraries and, you know, kind of globally unique identifiers on everything, so we don't, you know, deal with node ID collisions and references. But it is still a difficult problem to go and solve. So you could go and use deploy. It is why I've created a separate product kind of content hub that will handle those use cases for you. So, you know, when a piece of content is updated on the publishing site, the subscriber will automatically be pinged to see that there's content here and can go and ingest that within a few seconds, and will, you know, track where the node came from and, you know, point back to the original URL on the tag, and all those types of, you know, issues that you commonly run into. You know, common ones will be dealt with, but it is a
Deploy.
Well, deploy, yeah, essentially deploy the Drupal community kind of version of that, and then Acquia does have a content hub product that will do, you know, the same thing without having to muck around with deploy. It's more like a SaaS service connector modules.
Any other questions?
The single sign-on
Yes.
thing that you have with Site Factory, is that Acquia specific, like,
So, yeah, so it can be connected with organizations' SAML service. So we're making it as not proprietary as possible, unproprietary as possible. All right, I think we'll stop there. Thank you for.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Kevin.
And we have swag in the back.